Welcome to Not Just Ads, the show where B2B brands discover how creator-led content drives pipeline, builds trust, and grows long-term brand equity. Each episode, we speak with business leaders, founders, and creators who are defining their categories. I'm your host, Marcus Sherwin, and this is the creator economy for B2B. Hello, and welcome today to Not Just Ads, the creator economy for B2B. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Toby Leitch. Toby has a broad range of experience in SaaS. He's worked for a number of years on Fractional CMO and head of growth across a number of SaaS companies. More recently, is growth lead at Cradle, a bioprocessing company based out of Amsterdam. I'm delighted to be joined by him today. We're going to get into a number of different topics. Welcome to the show, Toby. And
thanks, Marcus.
Thanks for joining us. But before we kick it off, and we asked some of our guests this as well, is like, how did you get into what you're doing today? And what was it, direct path that you always wanted to get into growth marketing, or was it something that kind of you discovered during your career?
I actually discovered it during my career. I started tinkering with software very early on when I was a teenager. When I was about 12, I started writing websites, writing small little apps when it was still the Web 2.0 times. And that brought me into web design and general design. So I actually worked in a design agency before I finished high school. I initially wanted to become a designer, but then working in a design agency, I realized that the design is usually heavily influenced by the client, and the client was usually the marketing department. So I thought maybe I should look into marketing. And eventually I ended up at Bayer, which is a big pharmaceutical enterprise from Germany. You might know Aspirin. So I was then a part of the Aspirin brand team for the German market. And that's really what segued me into marketing. And that's where I am still today.
Very interesting. It's an interesting space as well, I think, in pharma, because when we think about like growth and so on, you have in Germany in particular, there's a huge, well-known pharma industry, a number of different big companies there that are create a number of well-known drugs, like you mentioned with Aspirin. From a marketing standpoint, what do you think are like kind of the biggest challenges for pharma companies in terms of like how they go to market and so on for marketing, from what you could see in those early days in Bayer?
Yeah, I mean, I was at Bayer for about 3 years. And so I think, having not been in that industry for quite a while, talking too much about how pharma goes to market, it's a very complex and different market, right? So now I'm at Cradle, and Cradle is a biotech software company, which is a very different space than pharma. But Aspirin specifically was such a big brand, and the brand budgets, of course, are very different from what you have in most software companies, right? So it's a B2C play, but it's also a B2B play, because you have to work with the pharmacies, you have to work with doctors. And so it's a very multi-angled and multifaceted, fascinating market. So that's why I always loved about pharma. We had strong ties to our research team in terms of new studies on the market, new studies on how our drugs were performing as opposed to other drugs. And we use that information to build really sophisticated marketing and sales programs, and work very closely with the sales team as well, which basically has to sell the drugs to the pharmacies, right? So it's a fascinating market, and it's such a complex market as well. And there's big budgets, there's big teams, heavy regulations. So I think it was the perfect start for my career, because I learned that it's not just like you post on LinkedIn and then you get a couple of leads in. It's really a complex market. And I think I learned to appreciate that early on there.
Yeah, no, definitely. It sounds like a really solid foundation to get into marketing with such a well-known company. It's an interesting one as well, because pharma, I guess, it's much more of like, now you can fill the listener in a bit more on this. Is it much more of an education-led first rather than, say, a traditional SaaS product, or it's more about maybe the functionality and so on? Whereas from pharma, what I understand would be it's much more about like educating the audiences on what the differences are, what you're actually solving for, or how, do they also market as well to the kind of what would I say, to the emotion as well when they're looking at marketing?
I think it is very emotional. It's very different because, of course, the marketing to the consumer is heavily regulated, right? There's very heavily regulation pretty much every country on the claims you can make and how you can make them, how you can advertise, right? Some of you might be familiar with how drugs are advertised in the US television, which is very different from how it's in Europe. Exactly, and I find that fascinating. It's fascinating to watch ads in the US because it's a different market when it comes to drugs. There is definitely appeal to an emotion as well, especially I was heavily working on the Aspirin complex brand, which is a cold and flu medication. And so very, very seasonal product, right? And the competitive intelligence that we had and the competitive marketing we were doing was mostly based around efficacy of the combination drugs that we had in our medication. But ultimately, you are marketing on different layers. You're marketing to the general audience that they should look for your brand. So it's very much brand marketing. You want people to recognize your brand when they go to the pharmacy. And you want to also build a trust with the pharmacist that they can recommend your product and stand in for what you're selling there. And so one of the key KPIs that the sales teams in pharma actually work with is a very unique one. It's called facing. So it's basically how much does your product show up on the shelf in the pharmacy.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so if you can see like one product showing up 5 times, it's just more visual, right? And so that's a KPI that's being tracked. And so it's fascinating, and you have this multifaceted way of selling. But it is very much based around efficacy, but ultimately also emotion, right? You tell stories about, you're being cold, you're being sick, for instance, in the cold market. Ultimately, it's also an emotion. People want to be healthy. And so that's probably one of the most important things as well.
Yeah. It's an interesting one you mentioned, I guess, because if you're in a pharmacy, it's essentially real estate, which is okay. It's you're in a specific pharmacy. They measure that, then the likelihood is like, okay, if I want to get a flu tablet, right, I'm going to go for whatever the leader is in the category. So it's, I guess there's some parallels to that if you're looking at, I don't know, B2B SaaS software in some cases of like how, if you're thinking of, say, I don't know, some kind of admin issue or some challenges, there's a parallel there as well.
There's a parallel, and I think there's also a big difference. I was in the OTC market, which is over-the-counter drugs, right? There's also the whole RX prescription drug market, which is again very different because you can't advertise prescription drugs, right? And there it's really more about working together with the clinical studies, working with the doctors, and building that trust with them so they can prescribe your drug, right? And there it becomes much more like a B2B play where it's about building trust. For one of the most important things, right? If you talk about cancer drugs, for instance, that's just something that trust is so important there for the brand trust, right? That your studies, that you feel like trustworthy, right? And so I think it's also a very fascinating space.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. I was listening to somebody recently. They were talking about Johnson & Johnson, and they were saying like years ago they had an issue with one of their products, but like how they actually handled it was like kind of the overcorrection, and kind of they recalled everything and they overcorrected. It cost them a lot in the short term, but in terms of like the equity of the brand in the longer term, they didn't lose out on it as much. So I guess in those situations when something like that happens, the stakes are so high. Like trust is such an important thing. Like if you lose that, trying to rebuild it then over time, it's a different thing because you're in a B2C market as people's lives are at stake.
Yeah, exactly. Now at Cradle, so Cradle is a software company in the biotech space, and one of our key markets is pharma. Just for context, because it's a complex market, so I don't think everyone here is going to be a biologist, but Cradle basically helps scientists engineer proteins faster, and proteins are those little biological machines that make everything work from medication to bio-based products. And ultimately, the vision for Cradle has always been that we want to help people engineer proteins faster so they can basically build the next industrial revolution from organic and bio-based products. The trust element is so important here because Cradle operates in the R&D phase, right? Cradle is not a company that works. There's a lot of software companies for biotech, for pharma that operate in the clinical space, be it a company like Viva Systems that help with managing clinical studies. It's a big company. Cradle operates in the what's called the discovery space, where it's about developing drugs in the early stages. And of course here it's also very much trust-based, right? So if we would make claims that then would be disproven easily, which has happened in this space as well, right? Especially in the AI space, there's so much hot air. And so for us, it's extremely important to build that trust and to not overpromise. And some of our competitors and some of our market co-competitors have had real issues with that because they've gotten a reputation of overpromising, and that ultimately backfires, especially when you work with engineers, with scientists. And so with new technology in a space that is maybe not super used to technology or uses software. So you have to be very careful there. And I think that's kind of the parallel between what I did in pharma and what we're doing at Cradle.
Yeah. So with Cradle then, your customers, the scientists, so do you do partnerships with pharma companies then, or how does the business model work?
Cradle is a SaaS company. We sell software platform, and partnerships is ultimately it is a partnership, and that we work together with the client, right? And it's a long-term relationship, and they use us in their research programs. I think the word partnership is a bit of a dangerous word in the pharma and AI software world, because there's a lot of companies that are partners on assets. So they will basically co-develop a medication, and then it will be licensed by a pharma company as a means of risk diversification for the pharma company. So in that sense, we're not a partnership company, but of course, like we have long-term partnerships with our customers, right?
Sure.
So
sure.
ultimately, we are a software company that helps scientists access cutting-edge AI in order to develop proteins faster.
And it's interesting, actually, because I was listening to, I can't recall his second name, but it's the CEO of Anthropic, Darius, his name escapes me, his second name. What he was, there was also an interview with the CEO of Eli Lilly, and what they were talking about was like how Eli Lilly are using Anthropic, but just even for kind of like internal mundane things of like reviewing, say, research papers. And they obviously have humans then that look over it after, but it seems that it has taken the time down significantly even for that part. So like he was just saying, like over time, if these efficiencies are kind of drawn in, and that you obviously have a overlooking of human, in turn, in time, you may have like drugs going to market significantly longer. Like I don't know, what is it, about 9 years is the average time now for like a drug from research to go to market, roughly, or a little bit longer?
Yeah, it's 9 to 12 years.
9 to 12 years, yeah. So I mean, if they can bring that down, and over time, and for like serious illness and stuff, the future, the impact of that alone can be significant. With your ultimate goal in terms of the vision for the company, for Cradle, what is it enabling then for like kind of scientists to do in terms of the proteins, of like kind of bring that efficiency for them? But ultimately, would that be part of contributing to that kind of go-to-market time quicker for them?
Yeah, ultimately, yes, that's ultimately the goal, right? So there's a number of facets here that I think my technical colleagues or our co-founders can speak to in more detail, and then you'll find many podcasts that I'm talking about as well. But the fundamental idea is that proteins are basically these strings of sequences, right? It's like a language almost that you might learn in from high school still, and it's basically like a language, and as models like ChatGPT work on language as well, right? So there's a bit of a parallel here, and it's a very complex thing to manage these sequences and to engineer them correctly, right? So it's ultimately very expensive, and you have people with a PhD on a small part of this only, right? So it's very heavy in terms of the knowledge you need and the expertise you need and the skill set you need, right? And so having a solution like Cradle really, really helps you to do that faster and also more intelligently, right? Because there's just AI can obviously access much more data than the scientists can hold in their head. But what's I think quite special about Cradle is that Cradle really operates in a partnership with the scientists, right? And so a lot of communication for the marketing, it's really important that we don't replace the scientists, right? So we basically help the scientists work faster and more efficiently to focus on the research in a better way. And that's ultimately also an element of trust, right? Because there's, of course, always in every industry, there's this fear of AI replacing you. And I think we've done a pretty good job at really showing the scientists, like we have our own lab in Amsterdam. In our office right behind me, there's a big wet lab. Yeah, and so the trust building element here is extremely important. Like I mentioned earlier, like if we wouldn't build that trust with the scientists, and for instance talk about scientist replacement, which would just generally will not happen, right? It would be a big issue for us. So for our marketing perspective, it's really important that we help scientists, but the scientist is the star. And I think one of our key mantras here is as well celebrate the scientist, right? We're like, our team is extremely geeky. It's full of amazing scientists and researchers, and we're really excited that we can help scientists just do more cool stuff. So marketing to scientists is a very interesting challenge, because people in the industry will generally tell you that it's all about data and it's all about facts. What I've been realizing, not only also working with engineers in other industries or working with financial professionals, that emotion is still a big part of this, and that this is often under-indexed in biotech marketing. So especially biotech marketing it's quite a bit behind other industries when it comes to emotion, but some of the same principles that work in other industries in SaaS that is a bit less deep techy do work as well. So we've noticed that a lot of our customers and a lot of our market really appreciates also things like explanation videos. We make videos about our lab workflows that we open source, and these are short explainer videos that a couple of years ago people would have told you, but like this is not complex enough, and you need to go more deep, and you need to have a big manual for all of this. And now there's like a 2-3 minute video that explains a simple workflow for us, and we share it, and people learn from each other. And the scientists are very used to sharing knowledge with each other, but especially in pharma, obviously there's a lot of IP, there's a lot of patents, patent protection, right? So it's quite competitive. But what I've been noticing is that in our content play that we've been putting out there over the last couple of months, that people really resonate, just like in every other industry, with emotions, with opinionated pieces, with sharing knowledge and education, right? And so the typical approach has always been white papers and events, right? So white papers and technical white papers and events to build the trust. And that is still true. Events are still powerful, right? White papers are still powerful. And like some of our most powerful marketing assets are competitions, are technical wins that we can put out, which are always difficult to put out in our industry because it always seems like an edge, especially pharma has obviously somewhat the most complicated legal processes when it comes to marketing releases. But every time we were able to put out case studies with concrete data, that's been a huge point, a helping point for our marketing. This is obviously true, but emotion education is also equally useful when you're talking to scientists, because ultimately they care about their job, they're really passionate about what they do, and they also want to exchange ideas. And so limiting yourself to super technical communication, actually, in my experience, is not the only way to do marketing. And I think that's a bit of an edge that we have, because we are emotional, but we're also very humble and talking to the scientist.
Yeah. It's how, in terms of then your go-to-market, like when you mentioned, obviously the scientists are your end user customer at the end of the day, but what do you do in terms of like when you're looking at growth now? Do you have, say, specific types of research centers of scientists that you know that they will use your software? If you're measuring up, say, a market opportunity, whether it's a different region that you're going into, how do you look at it normally?
Yeah, so Cradle is a software company, and so the potential market ultimately is huge, right? We can work in agriculture, we can work in industrial biology, we can work in pharma, of course. Ultimately, it depends a little bit on the research that's being done and how big your research organization is, right? So, like the big advantage of a software company versus a custom-built workflow that scales across many different use cases and many different projects. And maybe if you're a very small company, it might not be super attractive at the starting point because you maybe only have a small project to work on. Ultimately, we look a lot at like the kind of research that's being done. What do they work with? What kind of proteins do they operate with? Does it fit what we can do? Because of course our software can work with a lot of different modalities, a lot of different proteins, but it's still stronger in certain areas than others. And so we're trying to match that with the customers and just look at the different teams within the customer, how large certain teams are when it comes to pharma, when it comes to ag bio, and try to make sure that we're actually a fit for what they're looking for.
Sure.
And so one thing that, for instance, people that deep in the space get wrong is that there's a lot of AI and computational solutions around small molecules, but Cradle fundamentally is focused on the large molecules, right? So this is like, for instance, a big difference if you're not so familiar with the biology space.
Yeah. And then once you see then the opportunity, whatever the sector may be, whether it's biopharma, whether it's pharma, whatever it may be, you then, the customer or how you would go about it is targeting the enterprise organization, and then you work on a SaaS model. Is it that they have a license and then they can use the model based on the number of licenses within the organization?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a fairly new model. It's a licensing model. Exactly, they buy a license for our software platform. And yeah, the pricing model it's a bit complex, but it's on our website. But it's basically a software subscription license. There's no royalties, no milestones, which is also actually something that often customers push back in the sales calls, apparently. And that they're not used to that because in that space, it's very, very normal that companies charge based on if your drug that you develop with a solution hits a certain milestone, you'll get X% of the profits or of the revenue, which is something we don't do, which is actually very attractive for customers because they basically pay a SaaS license and there's no royalties, which is a big selling point for us.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's essentially like an open source then in a way. No, it's a subscription service, but it's like they have access to the model then, which is open source, and they can run the different kind of models based on the set that you share with them. Is it?
Not really. It's a software platform that works with the customer's sequence data. It's the customer ultimately can use a software platform that has the reliable infrastructure to organize and orchestrate these things together.
Oh, how do you see it then in terms of when you're looking at growth of like, say, some of the traditional levers that you can do growth? Like you mentioned about content a moment ago in terms of the explainer videos that are very targeted at scientists, but even other things like traditionally of like kind of SEO, even now kind of how you can influence like, say, AI search and so on. Because we'll touch on it in a second as well of like your experience of fractional work as a CMO and head of growth in different organizations, but particularly in Cradle, how does SEO play into like the growth play for your organization?
Yeah, so we are not heavily focused on SEO at the moment. I've been critical on SEO in the past because a heavy reliance on SEO often means that you're focusing on kind of the 5% of people that are currently in market, as search is fundamentally a demand capture channel, right? And especially when you build thought leadership, it's a laggard channel, right? People already know what they're looking for. And there's also been studies by Ahrefs that actually show that 2/3 of search traffic are branded traffic, so that include brand keywords, which fundamentally for me always has meant that search is a channel people go to when they've already know what they're looking for. And ultimately in marketing, our biggest job and challenge is actually to make people aware of what they should be looking for. Such a heavy over-reliance on SEO and performance marketing in general, I think has been at the core of the issue why marketing often doesn't get taken seriously, or especially in B2B, because it can be challenging. When it comes to AI optimization, what I see very critical at the moment is that everyone's trying to jump on the hype train, and I think I've gotten pitches from 20 different AI optimization companies over the last couple of months. I don't believe it's a very good idea to focus too much on AI optimization. I think it's a useful channel. We see people also finding us via AI tools, but I don't think that AI optimization per se is the right way of going about that, because its models are trained on a lot of community data like Reddit. There is a lot of press mentions in there. And obviously search results are also a factor, but I'm a heavy user for Perplexity, for instance, and Perplexity is very, very biased towards a certain type of media. And yes, blogs still help with that, but I think it shouldn't be the main focus. Ultimately, if you focus on getting a brand out there, getting a brand mentioned and trusted out, let's having influential bloggers talk about you, have people talk about you on social, on channels like Reddit, I think that ultimately going to trickle down into your AI optimization as well. So I think focusing too heavily on how do I now tweak this little channel is basically focusing on the little gear in the middle when you should be focusing on the big gear on the outside.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think it's probably a bit of shiny toy syndrome as well, of like kind of just focusing purely on this. And like what you say as well, I guess it's a similar rule for your sector. When you mentioned about the 5% of people that are in market, we see that across a number of verticals within B2B, that there's a huge percentage of the audience that are not in market. And if you're just going after like capturing demand and you think that you can do more of that in AI and so on, I think it's a small thing really that's going to really not really pay off in the long term. Whereas if you're seeing of like how you can actually influence perception in a longer term, that can definitely have much more of an impact, I would imagine, in the buying cycle. But I'm interested to hear in terms of, you mentioned about like kind of how bloggers and so on. What about creators then? For biotech, is that, and subject matter experts, is that something of what you see that has an impact? Are there particular kind of subject matter experts specifically that certain scientists will say like, okay, whatever they're like kind of sharing or that kind of content really resonates, or is it something that's kind of constantly evolving?
Yeah, I mean, Biotech is extremely active on channels like Twitter when it comes to the research community. And that's a big factor of it, that a lot of the research and scientists are active on technical channels like Twitter and Blue Sky. I think what's interesting is that the creator space in biotech is still very limited. So there are some really cool blogs. There are blogs and Substacks like Asimov Press by Nico McCarthy. There are blogs like Owl Posting, which Tech Meets Bio, right? There's different cool blogs. They're really interesting to read that we're also big fans of and often share internally. But the typical kind of social media influencer space, that's still pretty limited. And there's a big gap in here as well, because we noticed that once our founder and CEO, Steph, started posting more on LinkedIn, actually that was very, very successful, because there's a bit of a vacuum in that sense of people who bridge the gap and the business side, the science, the gap between the science and the business side of things. So that's been very interesting to see. And we've seen huge success on social channels by actually just addressing these things and talking about these things, because it's very few other people doing it. I think people are a little bit afraid of standing out in that space because people try to stand up with their research, but don't stand up with opinions too much. And getting scientists to be active on social media. That's been quite a challenge compared to other spaces. You know, us marketers, us
Yeah.
salespeople, they like to be loud. They like to talk
Yeah.
about it. But scientists, they they let the science talk. But I find that's the most fascinating thing about being a marketer in B2B is that there's so many incredibly interesting and smart people in our company, other companies, right? Engineers, scientists, subject matter experts, domain experts. And isn't the coolest thing that we can do as marketers is making those people shine and actually bring them out there and sharing with the world how cool the stuff they're working on is?
Yeah, definitely. It's just came into my mind how you see, you mentioned as well about your CEO sharing on LinkedIn, but I just wondered in terms of a growth play, if you've tested thought leader ads on LinkedIn, if that's been effective for kind of amplifying their voices further.
Absolutely, yeah. So I love thought leader ads. I find they're very effective means of getting target distribution. So I look at it as organic being a black box distribution that sometimes, you go viral every now and then, may never end up, no one knows where it ends up. And I like to say that when you go viral, the weirdos come out. That once you reach 100 thousands of impressions, there's always people who shit on your content, no matter what you do, which is also just a bit nasty, frankly, right? So, and the paid ads are a nice little measure to, when the post works well organically and you advertise it to the targeted audience, it's almost guaranteed to work, right? So I think that's very powerful, native advertising pretty much. And I think that's, an incredibly cool format and a new format that, LinkedIn is not the most innovative to social media channel. Some people argue it's not a social media channel at all, and but this thought leadership ads have been extremely cool medium that I really enjoy using because it helps people to discover your brand a different way. But that's extremely powerful.
Yeah, definitely. I think LinkedIn probably struggled for years with having a proper brand play. Like they were good at kind of this lead generation for a while for certain verticals, but I think when they saw that actually, people's profiles are getting more engagement than company pages to promote them, then it seemed like this is the perfect entry for them to kind of go into a brand play there. Before we finish up, Toby, I'd just like to ask you your opinion from going from Fractional to where you are now in Cradle. What are the pros and cons for people that are like in the fractional space versus then from working within an organization? What would you say like to people that are in that space?
Yeah, I've been in all shoes. I've been a co-founder in a bootstrap startup with Fintel, and I've been a fractional marketing leader, and I'm a full-time employee now. And this is my first full-time job in 10 years because I just found that Cradle was an extremely exciting opportunity to join as a company, just sheer because of the stuff we're doing and the impact we can have here. I think what the interesting thing about being a fractional was you could just see so many different machine rooms, right? You could just see into so many different companies and cross-apply your knowledge, which is a very unique opportunity. Having worked with probably 30 B2B software companies at this space, like at this time, this also really helps me be a better marketer here at Cradle because I just I've seen the places that work, I've seen the places that don't work, I've seen the things that go wrong. And ultimately, it also makes you a little bit allergic to performative marketing, right? Because you're trying to be, you're just trying to actually be effective in the short time that you have, right? And get stuff done. I do find that there's always a little bit of a half-life when it comes to external people. So usually you want to move to a more internal model at some point with fractional people because often people come in, they make their play, and then after maybe a year, usually the novelty wears off a little bit, and the management of the process, scale of the process becomes more important. So I do think being a long-term fractional for one company often is not the best option because you want to at some point go in-house and have a team and build in-house. But especially with Create, I love going deep. And sometimes I was just fed up also with kind of like having to context switch all the time.
Yeah.
There's enough context switching within one company, right? You work with different markets, different people, different teams, but it's quite exhausting to work with a IT service company in the morning, an HR marketplace in the afternoon, and then at night have another meeting with an industrials company. And that's, I think, a very great training ground. And you can often just apply knowledge from one space to the other. For me at this stage in my career, I was really excited to just like work very focusedly on one thing. My point was, do I want to build another company or do I want to help build this company? And that was a very clear yes. So I think it's a very exciting space to be in. But you also need to have something that, especially when you have an entrepreneurial streak, you're thinking about moving from fractional to full-time, or you're thinking about becoming fractional. There are downsides to both, right? So with a full-time job, you are in one space, right? You necessarily like have to also work within the structures and the teams, right? You can't just, get your excitement from another company, for instance. You have to get this into one company, right? And it's like, I'm lucky that I have a very high performing team here at Cradle with a lot of diversity in terms of people and thoughts and mindsets and backgrounds. And that's very enriching, right? You don't have that in every company, I admit that. But at the same time, being a fractional, you have to be also aware that it's it can be challenging. First of all, you have to sell, you have to get your clients in. That can be quite challenging, and grass not always greener. I think you should always experiment with both. I do think a fractional marketing leadership is a great solution for a lot of companies. I don't think people should always hire a marketing lead immediately. I think having a fractional person for 1 or 2 days a week is an amazing opportunity for most startups. But it needs to fit your personality as well. So, and if you're someone who loves to be in meetings all the time, who loves to basically like do processes and strategy and not actually getting shit done, being a fractional marketer is probably not for you, because you actually need to deliver results.
Yeah, it's true. I think everything always has a pro and a con to it, and it's not until you're actually in the process that you realize what that is. Everything from outside can be a different perception, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One final question before we finish up. Any predictions in where you see the B2B space, specifically in bioprocessing or even generally in where thought leadership is obviously a big topic now. B2B creators is another one, but anything specifically that you see in the next, say, 6 to 18 to 24 months that there's going to be a big focus on to drive growth for companies?
Yeah. I mean, biotech, by the way, that bioprocessing is a quite different space. So bioprocessing is a completely different market as well. Biotech is, I know, it's a very complex industry. So, and these things often sound very similar, but biotech and software, it's quite different from bioprocessing, which frankly is like, I get it. I have had that before as well, other industries. Where do I see the space going? So for me, right now, there's, in biotech specifically and in B2B, there is still a gap that people don't understand the power of social. That's a big gap right now. People always talk about the reach of LinkedIn going down, for instance, right? And I think that's happening on every platform, that at some point you want to advertise to your audience.
It's the evolution, I guess.
I think that's always a challenge. But fundamentally, I think we're seeing a revitalizing of kind of the brand marketing space, that people are understanding the power of brand more. And depending on always swings in two ways, but I think people are experimenting more with brand. I think there's brands like Clay that are experimenting with a lot of cool stuff in B2B. And we'll see more of that. People really experimenting with cool brands, with different brand positioning and content plays. That's one. I think a big trend that I'm seeing is also editorial content. So companies focusing on not just pumping out content talks about their brand, but actually making interesting content that the journalists would write. And so there's been huge layoffs in media, and I hope that a lot of those journalists are going to land in great B2B companies, because I think it's a perfect fit. And I'm certainly looking for next year for expanding our content team with journalists. I think that would be a really cool play to do. And yeah, I think that's my predictions.
Great. All right. Toby, if anyone wants to find you, where are you most active? Which socials do you share on, or where are also on Cradle as well? Where can people check out more about the company and what's happening there?
Yeah, you can check out Cradle on cradle.bio. It's our website. You can follow our co-founder, Stefan Rieken. You can follow me on LinkedIn.
Perfect.
So I think LinkedIn is a channel that we're very active on, and that's the best space to.
Great. We'll leave all the details in the show notes as well. Toby, thanks so much again for joining us. It was great to talk with you.
Thanks, Marcus.
Cheers.